Madison Taylor sat in the sterile, cold clinic room, the hum of the fluorescent lights above her matching the unease that crawled up her spine. The nurse had just left after taking blood samples, and the air felt thick, suffocating even. She hadn't planned on being here today, not this early at least. But when the symptoms had started, those strange rashes, the fevers that wouldn't subside, she couldn't ignore them anymore. She wasn't the type to panic easily, but a growing sense of dread had gnawed at her for weeks. The doctor walked in slowly, his face solemn. He didn't need to say anything Madison already knew. She could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the sympathy. She had read enough about HIV and AIDS in school, had heard enough rumors over the years to recognize what the diagnosis meant. "I'm afraid it's positive," Dr. Williams said gently, his voice a whisper, as if afraid the words might do more harm than the disease itself. Madison felt a chill run through her body. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she thought she might faint. She wasn't sure whether it was the shock of the news or the surreal feeling of hearing those words aloud, but she couldn't move. It was like the world had frozen around her. "Do you know how long you've had it?" Dr. Williams asked, watching her carefully, ready to provide information and resources, but Madison couldn't hear him anymore. The doctor's words blurred as the reality of what he said sank in. HIV. It wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a life sentence. A lifetime of medication, stigma, and a future shadowed by a virus that didn't forgive. Her mind reeled with questions. Who could have done this to me? Who? She whispered aloud, as though speaking the word might help her find the answer. "I'm going to have to ask you some more questions about your sexual history. We need to determine when and how you were exposed," the doctor said, clearly trying to take control of the situation. But it didn't matter. Madison's mind had already gone elsewhere, to a place far darker than the sterile room she sat in. The questions were a blur. Her mind was too preoccupied with one thing, one face. Jason Rodriguez. Jason had been everything to her. He was the charismatic fraternity senior with a smile that could charm anyone. Madison had met him a year ago at a college party. At first, she had been drawn to his confidence, his easygoing attitude. They'd had chemistry, that undeniable spark between them. One thing had led to another, and their relationship had blossomed over the months. Jason had seemed like the perfect guy, the kind who would never do something so wild. But as Madison reflected on their time together, everything seemed to fall into place. The late-night phone calls, the casual attitude he'd had about protection, his refusal to talk about their future, and those moments when he had seemed almost too careful with his own health. The warning signs had been there, but she had brushed them aside, blinded by trust, or perhaps by the illusion of trust. Then, there was the conversation she overheard. It was a few weeks before her diagnosis, and Madison had been at a small cafe near campus. She'd bumped into a few of Jason's fraternity brothers. At first, they were friendly, talking about the upcoming weekend plans. But then, as they moved closer to the table next to hers, she heard their conversation shift. "Man, did you hear about what happened with Taylor?" one of them said, his voice a mix of amusement and derision. "Yeah, dude, she actually thought he cared. Poor thing. She didn't know that Jason had her on a list with a few others. That girl, she's the latest." Madison's heart stopped. The blood drained from her face as the words crashed into her like a tidal wave. The laughter that followed made it even worse. They were mocking her. Her heartbreak, her pain, it had all been a joke to them. To Jason. Her world crumbled. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but everything suddenly made sense. Jason had known. He had intentionally infected her, knowing full well what he was doing. And now, his fraternity brothers were laughing about it. That was the moment Madison knew what she had to do. The betrayal cut deeper than the diagnosis itself. She had been used, played, and discarded, nothing more than a game to them. The feeling of powerlessness turned into something darker. She wouldn't let them get away with it. If Jason could destroy her life, she could do the same to him. No, she would do more than that. She would make him feel the weight of his actions in a way he could never escape. The next few days were a blur of anger and disbelief. She locked herself in her room, only coming out when absolutely necessary. She barely ate, barely slept. Her mind swirled with thoughts of revenge, planning her next steps with a cold precision that scared even her. The idea came to her one night as she stared at her phone screen. She needed to make them feel what she felt. She couldn't just expose Jason. No, she needed to spread the pain, to take it further. She would turn their own weapons against them. A plan formed in her mind, as dark and twisted as it was. She would use her body to carry out her revenge. She would infect as many men as possible, leaving behind evidence that would send the message she intended. And Jason, he would know. She spent days researching, creating fake accounts, and setting up profiles. Maddie Santos was born, a woman who would never be suspected. Through dating apps and social media, Madison would infiltrate the lives of men just like Jason, arrogant, entitled, and oblivious. They would never see her coming, and she would leave her mark on every single one of them.
Each new man she targeted, each new connection she made, brought her closer to the twisted sense of justice she sought. She followed a strict set of rules: no protection, no hesitation, no guilt. They would pay. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the toll of her actions began to weigh on her. Each encounter left her feeling emptier, more isolated. She could no longer look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgust. Her health began to deteriorate as well. She stopped taking her HIV medication, unable to care for herself while she was consumed by her need for vengeance. The voices of the men she had infected echoed in her mind, the faces of her victims haunting her. But the worst of it all were the nightmares. Night after night, she dreamed of Jason, his smug smile transforming into a twisted, mocking grin. Madison had begun to lose control. What had started as a calculated mission of revenge was quickly spiraling into something much darker. Madison sat at her desk in her small apartment in Albuquerque, her eyes glued to the screen of her laptop. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the glow of her computer. She had always considered herself a quiet, introverted person. But now, in the solitude of her apartment, she had become someone entirely different, someone driven by a singular, consuming purpose. The old Madison, the one who had trusted people, who had believed in love and kindness, felt like a stranger. She typed furiously, creating a new profile on yet another dating app, Maddie Santos, she typed, carefully crafting the bio. Young, adventurous, a little reckless, but playful, just enough to attract the type of man she wanted. No one would suspect her, not with a profile like this. She had learned from the best. Jason, in his arrogance, had never even thought about the consequences of his actions. But Madison would use the same tools to manipulate and deceive, using them to exact her revenge. Adventurous spirit with a love for good conversation and bad decisions, she wrote, her fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard as she crafted her words. It was the perfect hook. It was everything Jason would have wanted in a woman. It would be enough to reel in the first victim. Madison had learned quickly that her actions needed to be calculated. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. She couldn't afford to get too close. Each encounter had to be brief, impersonal, a calculated transaction, and most importantly, it had to leave behind a trail. She had to ensure that Jason, and anyone else who might get in the way, would understand exactly who was behind the chaos she was about to create. She was meticulous in her planning. Madison made sure to document everything. After each encounter, she recorded every detail in her journal. She photographed everything. She kept a digital archive of her meetings, evidence, all of it. She was careful to ensure that each man she met could be traced back to her actions. She wasn't just spreading HIV, she was building a case against herself that would one day lead back to Jason. 6 months passed. Madison's reach grew. Her list of victims swelled, each one an entry in a folder she labeled Karma. She wasn't just infecting random men, she was targeting a specific type, men who reminded her of Jason. Confident, cocky, entitled. The kind of men who would never think twice about the women they used and discarded. Men like Jason, who had shattered her world. She'd infiltrated dozens of lives by now. College students, married professionals, even older men with families. They all shared one thing in common: they were unaware of the darkness behind the smiling woman who seemed so easy to trust. Each man was like a piece on a chessboard, moving into her trap without even realizing it. Some had asked her to stay longer, to make things more personal, but Madison always refused. She didn't need any emotional attachment. This was business. This was war. Her first victim had been a college sophomore, a young man named Jake, who had been eager to meet her after only a few messages exchanged. She had met him at a bar, and they had immediately gone back to his apartment. It had been quick, no foreplay, just straight to the point. The entire time, Madison had kept her distance, emotionally and physically. She followed the rules: no protection, no hesitation. By the time Jake had realized what had happened, it was too late. The encounters had continued in this pattern, methodical, precise. She began to recognize the signs in the men she met. The ones who had no idea of the dangerous game they were about to play. She was like a predator, calculating every move, anticipating their next action. It was almost too easy. The more she succeeded, the more the poison of her anger grew, festering inside her, becoming harder to control. But as Madison continued her vengeful path, something started to change. The thrill of it began to fade, replaced by something darker. The satisfaction she had felt at first, when she saw the results of her actions, when she knew she was taking back control, was quickly overshadowed by a growing sense of emptiness. Her health was deteriorating. The nightmares had begun. She could no longer sleep through the night without being haunted by the image of Jason's face, twisted and distorted in her dreams. Madison had stopped taking her HIV medication. She didn't care anymore. There was no point in prolonging her life if it meant continuing to carry out the twisted revenge that was consuming her. The medication had become a reminder of the woman she once was, the woman who had trusted, who had believed in the future. But the future was gone now. All she had was the present, the mess she had made, the lives she had ruined. She couldn't even remember the last time she had smiled, or felt anything that wasn't anger or regret. Despite her deteriorating health, she couldn't stop. She had gone too far, and there was no turning back. Every encounter felt like a step deeper into darkness. The men she met now were just faceless objects, tools for her plan. Yet, as she continued this mission, Madison began to feel something creeping at the back of her mind, a sense of self-loathing that was growing stronger by the day. She had started this as an act of revenge, but now, it was a way to numb herself, to escape the pain of her reality. She had become as cold and ruthless as the man who had started this all. The whispers began. Rumors of a woman who had been seen in various cities, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, picking up men, engaging in casual encounters, and then leaving without a trace. Her identity was unknown, but the results were undeniable. An unusually high number of men who had suddenly tested positive for HIV began to link their encounters to the same mysterious woman. The trail was thin at first, just whispers in the community, but as more men came forward, the pattern became clear. The name Maddie Santos was whispered in hushed tones, but no one could prove anything. Not yet. Madison had been careful to cover her tracks. She changed her phone number, deleted profiles, and moved from city to city, always leaving behind just enough evidence to link her to the men she had encountered. She knew the police would eventually catch up with her, but she had a plan, one that would ensure Jason would never escape the consequences of his actions. She was the one who would expose him, and the world would know what he had done to her. But she didn't know how close she was to the edge. It was only when she met Mark Torres, an investigative journalist who had begun digging into the mysterious cases of men infected with HIV, that things truly began to spiral out of control. She hadn't intended for him to be a part of the plan, but something about him intrigued her. Maybe it was the way he asked questions, the way he seemed to understand the stories behind the headlines. He wasn't just another man to be used. He had a purpose, one that could either expose her for the monster she had become or provide her the leverage she needed to get justice. The weeks dragged on like an endless, unbroken march through mud. Madison's health, both physical and mental, continued to deteriorate, but she pressed on. Each encounter felt more like a transaction than an act of revenge. The faces blurred together, their names lost in the haze of her obsession. She was no longer able to look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgust. Her skin had become pale, her eyes hollow, as though the very act of spreading her venom had drained her of any remaining humanity. But in those dark moments, when she felt like she might break, she remembered Jason. And then she remembered why she was doing this. She wasn't just hurting these men, she was punishing him. She was sending a message to Jason Rodriguez and every man like him: this is what happens when you play with someone's life. But the world was catching on. Slowly at first, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. The rumors started circulating, whispers in the community about a mysterious woman infecting men with HIV. No one knew who she was or what her motive might be, but it didn't take long before people started putting pieces together. Madison tried to ignore the gossip, but the weight of it pressed in on her. She had to stay ahead of the curve, keep moving, keep her tracks covered. She began to change her appearance, her hair, the way she dressed. She took new identities on dating apps, made up new names, always one step ahead of the whispers. But as more and more men came forward to report their encounters, the trail she had worked so hard to conceal began to narrow. One afternoon, as Madison scrolled through her phone, she saw a headline that made her stop cold. It read, "Mystery woman linked to HIV outbreak in New Mexico." Her heart skipped a beat. It was happening. Someone was getting too close. Madison quickly opened the article, scanning the text for any mention of herself. But it wasn't her name that stood out, it was a name she hadn't expected. Mark Torres. Mark Torres was an investigative journalist who had recently started covering the string of HIV infections that seemed to be spreading across the state. He had pieced together a connection between the victims and begun to investigate the possibility that they were all linked to a single woman. She wasn't just a random figure in the background anymore, she was now the focal point of an investigation that could unravel everything. Madison felt a flicker of fear. She had been so careful, so precise in her movements, but now her life, her plan, was in jeopardy. She had never planned on getting caught, never thought she would be anything more than a name on a police report. She had been so focused on Jason, on revenge, that she hadn't considered how much attention her actions would attract. Her fingers trembled as she read the article in full. Mark Torres had interviewed several of the men who had tested positive for HIV. Some had been reluctant to come forward, fearing embarrassment or worse, but others had spoken openly about their encounters with a woman they now realized was part of a larger pattern. Torres was starting to connect the dots. His investigation had been methodical, and he had spoken to enough victims that he was beginning to paint a clear picture of the woman behind the HIV outbreak. What if Mark knew? What if he had already figured it out? A strange, unfamiliar sensation began to build in Madison's chest: fear. But it was more than just fear, it was desperation. She couldn't afford to be caught now. Not when she was so close. Not when Jason was still out there, living his life with no consequences. It wasn't long before Madison took action. She had to get to Mark Torres before he got to her. The only way to stop him was to control the narrative, to make him believe that he was chasing the wrong lead. She knew exactly how to do it. Her next target was Mark Torres. It wasn't a coincidence. Madison had been watching him for weeks, following his movements, reading his stories. She had learned everything about him, from his professional history to his personal life. Torres was a journalist, passionate, sharp, and persistent. He wasn't like the other men she had targeted. He wasn't part of the pattern she had set, but in a way, that made him the perfect person to infiltrate. She crafted a new profile for herself, this time using her real name, with a subtle twist. She pretended to be a woman who had suffered at the hands of the same people he was investigating, someone who knew the truth but hadn't been able to speak out. Her story was one of pain, one of betrayal, and, of course, it was a lie. But it was a good one. She reached out to Mark through a direct message, pretending to be a victim who wanted to share her side of the story. The message was brief, cryptic, just enough to lure him in. She knew that someone like Torres would be eager to investigate any lead, no matter how small. The first time they met, it felt like a game to Madison. Mark Torres was everything she expected, intelligent, intense, and dedicated to his work. They met in a quiet cafe in Albuquerque. Madison had chosen the location carefully. It was in a part of town where she knew the hustle and bustle would make it easy to disappear if things went wrong. She kept her distance at first, letting Mark ask his questions, feeding him just enough information to keep him interested. She was careful with her words, never revealing too much, always leaving him wanting more. It was the dance of deception that she had perfected. She knew how to manipulate people, how to make them believe that she was someone worth trusting. But as the interview continued, Madison realized that Mark was different. He wasn't swayed by her charm or her story. He pressed her for more, asking pointed questions about the men she had been in contact with, the locations she had visited. He was starting to get closer to the truth, closer to the reality she had worked so hard to hide. His questions were sharp, insightful, and he was beginning to see through the cracks in her story. Something about the way Mark was looking at her unsettled Madison. It wasn't just that he was getting closer to the truth, it was the way he made her feel. For the first time in months, she was not in control. The thrill of her revenge was slipping through her fingers, replaced by the cold grip of fear. "I know you're hiding something," Mark said softly, his gaze unwavering. "But I'm not the one you need to worry about. It's the people who are behind this. You think you're the only one being hurt here?" His words cut through Madison like a knife. She wasn't the only one being hurt. For a moment, Madison thought she might break, might confess everything. But no. She couldn't. She had come too far. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Maybe you don't," he said softly. "But I'm going to find out." The tension in the air felt thick, suffocating. Madison couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a bottomless abyss. Mark Torres's words had stayed with her long after their meeting. He knew something, that much was clear. She could see it in his eyes, the unshakable belief that he was on the verge of uncovering the truth. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of paranoia. Madison felt as though she were always looking over her shoulder, waiting for someone to finally catch up with her. She tried to stick to her plan, keep up the facade, but there were cracks forming everywhere. Her health continued to decline. She wasn't taking her medication, and her body was beginning to show signs of the toll that years of neglect and anger had taken. Her skin was thinner, her eyes sunken, and her energy was quickly fading. But none of that mattered, she had to finish this. She couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close to destroying everything Jason had built. Her mind kept replaying her final confrontation with Mark. She had done everything she could to mislead him, but somehow, she knew he wasn't buying it. He had asked the right questions, dug deep, and his instincts were sharper than she had anticipated. Madison knew that he was getting closer to the truth, and if he wasn't already piecing it all together, it wouldn't take long for him to connect the dots. She wasn't just a random woman spreading HIV, she was the catalyst for a massive investigation. Mark's article on the mystery woman was gaining traction, and the police were starting to take notice. It wasn't long before they started tracking down victims, compiling testimonies, and linking them to the same strange pattern. The authorities had finally gathered enough evidence to connect the dots. Madison Taylor was the person behind the outbreak. They had hotel records, social media accounts, and dating app profiles, all of which pointed back to her. The dossier they compiled painted a clear picture of a woman who had methodically infected over 50 men across multiple cities. The evidence was damning, and the walls were closing in on her faster than she could outrun them. Mark Torres's article had done more than just connect the victims, it had become the breakthrough the authorities needed. The journalist's investigation had sparked a firestorm of attention, and soon, every detail of Madison's vengeful campaign was laid bare in the public eye. Her carefully constructed anonymity was slipping away, and soon, she would have no choice but to face the consequences. But Madison wasn't ready to give up. She hadn't thought about surrendering, not until the morning she woke up to a knock on her door. It was a cold morning in early spring when Madison's world finally started to crumble. The knock at her door was like the sound of thunder, loud and final. She didn't have to open the door to know what it meant. She could hear the voices of the officers on the other side, muffled but clear. They had come for her. Her time had run out. For a moment, Madison thought about running. She could leave, go somewhere new, disappear. But then, the thought hit her, where would I go? There was nowhere left to hide. She had exhausted every avenue. The police had the evidence, and Mark had published enough details to put the entire case together. She couldn't outrun the truth. With a sigh, Madison opened the door. 2 officers stood on the other side, their expressions grim. One of them stepped forward and, without ceremony, read her the charges against her. Madison Taylor, you're under arrest for the deliberate transmission of HIV, assault, and numerous other charges related to your actions over the past year. You have the right to remain silent. Her mind was a blur as the officer continued. The words felt distant, as though she were hearing them from a place far away. It was only when the cold handcuffs closed around her wrists that the reality hit her. She was caught. It was over. The officers led her out of the apartment and into the back of a police car. The drive to the station was silent, and Madison's thoughts raced. There was no escape now. She had planned everything with precision, with vengeance in her heart, but now she was facing the consequences. Everything she had done, every man she had infected, every lie she had told, there was no way to take it back. Her mind turned to Jason Rodriguez. The man who had started it all. The man who had infected her, who had ruined her life. It was his betrayal that had set this all in motion. Madison had believed that she was in control, that she was the one who would get the last word. But in that moment, as she sat in the back of the police car, she realized that revenge had consumed her. It had destroyed her, just as much as it had destroyed the lives of the men she had infected. And in the end, it had left her empty. When Madison arrived at the police station, she was processed, her mugshot taken, and she was placed in a holding cell. She sat there, staring at the walls, unable to think clearly. Her head throbbed with the weight of everything that had happened. She had been so focused on the destruction she wanted to cause, she hadn't realized how much of herself she had lost along the way. The woman she had been, innocent, hopeful, felt like a distant memory. In her quest for revenge, she had destroyed her future, her health, and her soul. It wasn't long before Mark Torres came to see her. The journalist had been tracking the case closely, and now he was standing in front of her, his gaze steady but not unkind. He had followed her from the first moment he realized that the cases were connected, and now he had the answers he had been looking for. Madison wasn't sure why he had come to see her, but she could feel his eyes searching her face, studying her every move. "You did it," Mark said quietly. "You followed through. But it's over now." Madison looked at him, her eyes dull. "I didn't have a choice," she replied softly. "He ruined me. I wanted to make him feel what I felt. To make him pay." Mark's expression softened, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. "I know what it's like to want revenge. But this? What you did, this wasn't justice. It was destruction." Her lips trembled. The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. "I know," she whispered. Madison had always believed that revenge would give her the peace she so desperately craved. But in the end, it had only made everything worse. She had betrayed herself just as much as she had betrayed the men she had infected. There was no peace in her heart, only regret. The trial that followed was a public spectacle, one that garnered national attention. The media dubbed it the "blood vengeance trial," a reminder of the destructive power of unchecked anger. Madison's victims testified, sharing the devastating impact her actions had on their lives. Some had lost their families, others their careers, and all had their health irrevocably altered. Madison took the stand at her trial, her voice trembling as she recounted her story. She spoke of betrayal, of how Jason had infected her, and how that betrayal had driven her to lash out. But as the days passed, and the courtroom heard from the men she had hurt, it became clear that Madison's actions had crossed a line that couldn't be justified. The jury found her guilty on all counts, and she was sentenced to prison for the rest of her life. In prison, Madison had time to reflect on the choices she had made. She worked to earn her GED, then a college degree. She used her writing to channel her guilt and regret, penning books and articles that aimed to educate others about the consequences of revenge. She became a voice for those who had been hurt by her actions, advocating for HIV awareness and the importance of seeking help rather than letting anger fester. Madison would spend the rest of her life behind bars, but in the silence of her cell, she finally came to understand the true cost of revenge. It had cost her everything, and in the end, it had solved nothing.